Hi friends, my name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. So I wanted to talk to you about the Integrity Initiative, which is a British government-funded think tank which basically has been attacking, it should be a huge scandal, it's been attacking Jeremy Corbyn and anybody on the left who's pushing anti-war. And they've been given at least a couple of $1 million, probably more. And there are some basic chapters of this integrity initiative. And one of them will be in the United States, or more than one. So it's basically there to attack Corbyn and using the idea of Russian, sort of interference and Russian collusion and all that kind of thing. Russian disinformation, that sort of narrative. I wanted to share with you a few excerpts from a really good moderate rebels report about this issue. As they said, it should be a huge scandal, a British government-funded, smear campaign basically against Jeremy Corbyn and anti-war activists and independent journalists, and also Julian Assange. I think that's involved there. But anyway, it's and it's also involved with MI6, which is the equivalent of the CIA in the United States. So it's a bit like it's not a bit like, it's like the Operation Mockingbird that they started off. Operation Mockingbird was something that was started off by the CIA, where they were infiltrating all major news networks and to start putting out a government narrative, a narrative that favors imperialism and war. And that's, of course, been going on now. In fact, Bob Woodward, who's nothing to write home about now, he was the one that helped break the Watergate scandal, but now he's just an establishment tool too. But in the 70s, he wrote there was about 400 journalists even in the 70s that were part of this Operation Mockingbird. So that's sort of a something that's kind of quite scandalous, and yet you probably won't hear about it much. So look out for the Integrity Initiative, and that's on, you can find them on Twitter, always retweeting stuff that's linking Jeremy Corbyn to to being a useful idiot and a Putin tool and all that kind of thing. They retweet any sort of anything by any sort of what is actually a useful idiot. Anybody who's promoting this anti-Russian propaganda, they basically retweet those people. And this is very serious, and I'm not sure if they have anything to do with the smearing Jeremy Corbyn in relation to making out that he's anti-Semitic because he's criticizing the Israeli government and the apartheid situation for Palestinians, which is not anti-Semitic, to call out apartheid, but he's been smeared regularly for that. And this is all in an attempt to basically try and ruin his chances of winning the next election. And I think despite that, I think the British people are smarter than that, hopefully. But I don't know if this whole Russian interference thing is actually taking with people. That's a big sort of psyops thing. It's a big propaganda thing to distract from a lot of issues. It starts to become like the Onion, basically, after a while. Anyway, with dangerous consequences, sadly. But anyhow, I'll play you these excerpts, and I think you'll find them very interesting. But consider watching the whole program of the moderate rebels, and I'm going to leave a link in the information section and in the comments section. So that's really all I had to tell you. Just check out the Integrity Initiative. I mean, isn't that name in itself is so suspect. Anyway, so I hope that you're having a nice holiday season. Please like this if you wish, if you like it. And also please click the notifications bell and subscribe to the channel at Vegan Trove if you like this content. And share it with others if you wish. Don't forget to click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive any updates. So anyhow, so that's really all I wanted to say, and thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.
Moderate
Rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton here with Max Blumenthal. Today we're going to talk about what should be one of the biggest scandals in the world. I'm talking about the Integrity Initiative. This is a think tank that has been recently exposed as a British government-funded organization that has essentially been laundering pro-government, pro-NATO propaganda through the corporate media while ostensibly countering Russian disinformation. For years now, we've been talking about how Russiagate has been weaponized to attack the left and anti-war and anti-imperialist activists. And this is really a case study of this in action. We see that the Integrity Initiative is a British-funded think tank that has been attacking Jeremy Corbyn, the leftist leader of the Labour Party in the UK. So we have a British-funded organization attacking the opposition and also attacking some of us, left-wing, progressive, anti-war journalists. And we're also going to talk specifically about an article that Max just published at the Grey Zone Project. It's called Inside the Temple of Covert Propaganda, the Integrity Initiative, and the UK's Scandalous Information War. And
it's a fireable offense, or it should be. But, if you're listening to this and you're kind of getting lost in the details, basically what we're talking about are journalists who are acting as covert assets for the British intelligence services. And this should be a gigantic scandal, but it's not being reported in mainstream media. And one of the reasons is because it appears that many of the journalists, at least in the more mainstream publications across Europe, especially in the UK, have participated in events and various conferences of the Integrity Initiative. There was one at the Frontline Club that we learned about last month. It's unusual. I looked on the Frontline Club's past events page and it wasn't listed, but this is a pretty major event on Russian disinformation. You had James Ball, who writes for The Guardian, trashing Julian Assange routinely. He said Julian Assange has nothing to fear about an indictment, and then we learn there's an indictment. Or being extradited, and we learn the U.S. wants to extradite him. You have Carol Cadwalader, and she just won a major journalism award for her work, where she basically is ginning up this idea that Russian bots were responsible for Brexit. And various other journalists were participated in an Integrity Initiative conference. What does this say about the state of journalism? How close can we assume journalists are to this British military intelligence cutout? And to what extent does it resemble Operation Mockingbird, the CIA program during the Cold War, where journalists were actually paid to basically produce CIA talking points?
Yeah, Max, in your article at the Grey Zone, you cite a 1977 Rolling Stone article that was by Carl Bernstein, and he wrote, quote, more than 400 American journalists in the past 25 years have secretly carried out assignments for the CIA.
Yeah. What's the American connection? We have a lot of U.S. listeners and I guess watchers.
So yeah. there's an attempt. They've got these clusters, right? There's the UK cluster, the Netherlands cluster, the Baltics cluster. They're trying to set up a US and Canada cluster, and they're trying to do that through the creation of a 501c nonprofit in DC called the Institute for Statecraft and Governance. I think it's called. I'm not sure if it's been set up yet. We haven't discussed.
No record of it that I can find.
And that is intended then to take the Integrity Initiative model forward in the US. Now, obviously, that would mean technically that it should register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which, as all of your US listeners will know, was created in order to stop Nazi apologists from influencing US politics. And we've kind of come full circle with that, haven't we, with this particular initiative. They haven't, so far as we've seen, registered with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but they have got people involved in the US, sometimes in the UK clusters, like in Anne Applebaum's case, but also people in the State Department, people who are currently working in the State Department, who are said to be part of their US cluster. So it's not clear whether they're working for the US government or for the British military intelligence operation.
Yes, it's not clear whether they're working for the U.S. or British military intelligence, but here I think you're referring to Todd Leventhal, right?
Yeah.
Todd Leventhal is mentioned in the documents as Todd at one point, who gave us access to the Global Engagement Center. Now, for years in the U.S., there has been a prohibition on domestic propaganda. It was called the Smith-Mundt Act. That was repealed under Obama, under pressure from these kind of new Cold Warriors. And Todd Leventhal is now at a place in the State Department called the Global Engagement Center, which was originally set up to fight ISIS propaganda, but now is solely focused on Russia, and it is conducting domestic propaganda. Although Todd Leventhal says in his bio that he's retired, he's currently there. And now we learn that he's not only part of the U.S. cluster of the Integrity Initiative, he is actually listed as a team member. So, I mean, what does this mean that you have a State Department official who is a member of a team for a British military intelligence cutout?
Well, I don't know. You'll need to go and investigate that and tell us more. But I mean, obviously, the question it raises is whether he is subverting his own employer, or whether, I mean, who knows if the State Department is aware of this kind of connection to the intelligence services in the UK, and whether they approve of it or not. I mean, I would imagine, not being a bit innocent about these things, that the State Department would not approve of such a connection and activity.
Only in America. I mean, maybe this could be considered kind of like collaboration, like the kind of collaboration we do with the Israelis when Richard Perle and Douglas Feith spirit out classified U.S. intelligence to the Israeli Mossad. I don't know. But it does seem like a very unusual case of someone acting as a potential double agent.
That's right. And so you've also got the position that, you know, let's remember that this whole thing about Russia and the Russian threat and Russiagate was a huge thing, is a huge thing still in the US, that there was a British role in that, the infamous dossier created by the MI6 agent Christopher Steele. And there are documents amongst the leaks which show a meeting or a list of people who are associated with a particular issue on which features the name of Pablo Miller, who worked in the same organization, Orbis Business Intelligence, as Christopher Steele, and who is known to have been the handler of Sergei Skripal, who was, of course, poisoned in Salisbury earlier this year. Now, what on earth they are doing talking with Pablo Miller, who has, of course, gone to ground since the Skripal poisoning, I don't know. But there's a sense there that actually what we're seeing is something which is very much akin to what's been happening with the State Department in attempts to foist this kind of notion of Russia, the Russian threat, in US politics. And so we're essentially seeing, I think it's fair to say, a sort of division within the ruling elites in the UK and the US, where there are those who want to promote the Russia threat, and those who are less keen on that. And that thing is part of the politics here.
I would just kind of look at this as something, significant to the wider narrative of Russiagate. I mean, it's always said, among those of us who are skeptics or critics of this narrative, that it's an elite narrative. But here we see evidence that it's not just an elite narrative, it's an intelligence services narrative that's foisted on the public in collaboration with figures in the media who are eager to collaborate with the intelligence services to hype up this threat.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's clear that some of the people who are involved in this are aware, they're ideologically committed and are aware. Maybe it's the case that some of the other ones are not so aware. But certainly lots of the journalists who are said to be involved in this have denied it, have pretended or said that they're not involved.
Yeah.
And that they mistakenly got their name on an email list and it was terrible and they really shouldn't have had the document and all that stuff. But I mean, it's clear that some of them are very ideologically committed and are aware of the intelligence links that they are involved in.
Yeah, and I think what's especially amazing about this is that in general, many U.S. corporate media outlets already kind of act as vehicles for U.S. intelligence leaks. If you look, especially at the Washington Post, it calls itself the kind of resistance newspaper. Its slogan is "Democracy dies in darkness." In the past 2 years, I mean, of course, much longer than 2 years, but specifically since Trump has come into office, it really has acted as kind of like the water carrier for the CIA. There's all these official, essentially what you would say are like kind of official leaks, like
Yeah.
leaks that intelligence agencies kind of agree should go out in the public. And what's incredible is that even if these journalists don't themselves aren't wittingly collaborating with intelligence, they're essentially acting as water carriers for U.S. intelligence. And this is so clear when you look at the reporting on a few issues. I mean, you mentioned Ukraine, also Syria, Saudi Arabia. On Syria, what's so amazing is that even if these people aren't working with intelligence, their reporting is all based on U.S. officials and British officials. A great example of this is today, it's December 19th. Yesterday, on December 18th, the Washington Post published this story by Louisa Lovelock, who's this young foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. And this entire article is about how any criticism of the White Helmets is all just Russian disinformation.
No. That it gets the White Helmets killed. It's getting them killed.
Exactly.
And so we're killing rescue workers by criticizing or thinking.
Yeah. If you acknowledge the fact that the White Helmets work exclusively in opposition-held territory, in Al-Qaeda-dominated territory in Idlib, they have participated in, or they facilitated rebel assassinations, any of this, then you're helping them get killed. You're helping aid workers get killed. And what's hilarious is you go through this Washington Post article, which is sold as some kind of great original scoop. Here are all the sources. Every single source is like a U.S. government flack. Bellingcat, which is funded by the NED, the U.S. government's regime change arm, and is just full of NATO flacks. Anonymous former White Helmets are quoted, who are all anonymous. The U.S. State Department is quoted. The White Helmet spokesperson, Radal Salah, is also quoted, who again is funded by the U.S. government, and an anonymous Western diplomat. So even if she's not working directly with intelligence, her entire report, every single source, is U.S. government linked.
Well, and let's not forget, of course, that the White Helmets Mayday Rescue is funded to a large extent by the Foreign Office from the same budgets that come to support the Integrity Initiative.
And the Foreign Office, as we demonstrated in a little chart, not as elaborate as Alexander Reed Ross's charts, but we did a little chart just to show that the Foreign Office oversees the GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA, and MI6, the foreign intelligence arm. So it's not just the State Department. They're not just doing diplomacy. And then they have the Conflict Fund, which has actually been exposed for giving direct funding to jihadists in Syria through the BBC. It wasn't like we were doing it and you can't believe us because we're not government funded and therefore credible. So, and the Conflict Fund is also funding. They're also funding the Integrity Initiative, and it appears through these documents that the Integrity Initiative has been presiding over meetings between government intelligence officials and diplomats and the White Helmets. Is that correct?
That's what it appears to be the case. One of the alleged meetings with the White Helmets is just this list of email addresses, so it's not clear exactly what that meeting was. I suspect that we will have more documents on this since it was Anonymous Europe who mentioned the White Helmets. It's not in the document itself. But the White Helmets are mentioned elsewhere in the documents as potential speakers at events. So I'm anticipating that we will find more out about that as time goes on.
Let's talk about one other angle of this whole saga. I mean, there's so many different angles, and we're getting new documents every week, it seems. There's so many moving parts. But one of the most fascinating aspects to me, and I think to a lot of listeners who are American, will be this character, Simon Bracy Lane. He's a staffer at the Institute for Statecraft, which oversees this whole initiative. He's a young person. I never heard of him before. A reporter was tipped off by Craig Murray, the former ambassador, British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who's kind of a dissenter in British media now. The reporter's name is Kit Clarenberg. He works for Sputnik Radio, and he was tipped off about the address of the Institute for Statecraft. He went in there and he was removed by this staffer, Simon Bracey Lane, and then he started looking into his background just because he was removed so angrily. And, I'd been looking into this guy too and found the same thing, which kind of raised some unusual alarm bells, which was that Bracey Lane was kind of a miniature media star. He made several cameo appearances in the 2016 American primary campaign as a field worker in Iowa for the Bernie Sanders campaign. And he was, profiled by AFP and BuzzFeed as the Brit for Bernie, the British Bernie bro. And he talked about how he spent all his money, saved all this money up to go on a road trip across the U.S. And then he just suddenly decided that he wanted to work for Bernie, and he gets into the Bernie campaign. He said, that he'd never had an interest in British politics before to AFP, but to BuzzFeed, he says, that he was inspired to rejoin the Labour Party when Corbyn was elected leader. So there's some contradictions there. And then he gets involved in progressive politics in the UK in a Get Out the Vote campaign for progressive candidates, gets more access to progressive campaigns. And then suddenly he joins this initiative, which appears obsessively focused on attacking the very politicians that he said that he supported. And in one of the documents that turns up among the hacked documents of the Institute for Statecraft, it says that Bracey Lane conducted a special study of Russian interference in the U.S. electoral process, and that's listed right next to his experience with Bernie Sanders, as though he conducted that study while on the Sanders campaign. Remember, this is an internal document. No one thought it was ever going to be seen by the public. It appears to me very strange and raises the question about whether confidential assets were placed into the Bernie campaign as they were in the Trump campaign through Stefan Halper.
And it's been suggested in some of the reporting on this that he looks like he's got some kind of intelligence profile. I have no idea if that's the case or not, but it's a very, very curious thing for someone to be a professed Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn supporter to end up in a military intelligence linked propaganda campaign.
Yeah, definitely. Raises questions that, this whole story is so hard for so many people to unpack, and the major media isn't doing it. And this would be a question that I think Bernie Sanders supporters should really be grappling with, because of the way that Russia, along with the, bogus anti-Semitism charge in the UK, has been used against Corbyn. I always said that, if Sanders had gotten the nomination, you got a socialist here. He doesn't have a record of being like a Cold Warrior, that they would have used the Russia issue against him. And he had given interviews to RT just as Corbyn had. Who's to say they won't do it if he runs in 2020?
Well, they will. Of course they will. They'll use anything. The experience, as you know, in the UK in the last 3 years has been that they will use anything. They will use anti-Semitism. They will use alleged misogyny. They will use alleged racism. They will use all sorts of things which are largely false. And they will use the relationship, the alleged relationship with Russia, the Putin's shill or the former apologists for the Soviet Union, all that stuff will be used, and it will come from a variety of sources.
We should also talk about the other sources of funding. So at first, it looks like the Integrity Initiative in the early years was entirely funded by the British Foreign Office, but we also have a document that shows that when the Integrity Initiative was applying for more funding from the British government, it said that it had secured funding from NATO, from the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, and Lithuania is one of the key states, as we mentioned, where there's this kind of Holocaust revisionism going on. There's a huge far-right movement trying to rewrite the history of the Holocaust. Apparently, the Integrity Initiative claimed that it had also secured funding from the U.S. State Department, including £250,000, and Facebook. Facebook apparently had also given £100,000 for research and education activities. So
Yep.
this is pretty wild. It shows again that social media giants are collaborating with these parastate institutions that are supposedly monitoring disinformation on social media and censoring voices that oppose the Anglo-Saxon worldview.
Sure. But the other thing to note, of course, though, is that before the Foreign Office started funding the Institute for Statecraft in 2017, the Institute for Statecraft had a donation from a private individual of £407,000. Right? Now, we don't know who that was, and we would like to find that out. So that remains to be found out. Plus, there is also other material in their early accounts which suggests other funding from NATO, from the Foreign Office, from the Ministry of Defence, which has so far not been admitted to by either the MOD or by the Foreign Office. So there's still questions about that. But yes, you're absolutely right about the Lithuanians. And of course, the Lithuanians have been involved in training the 77th Brigade. That's the propaganda brigade of the British Army. So we're seeing British soldiers being trained by the Defence Department of a country which is engaging in Holocaust revisionism, which is, again, extraordinary.
Yeah, according to this document, which another colleague and friend of the show, Yasha Levine, reported on, Max includes it in his Grey Zone article. It says that the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense would be providing all costs for their Stratcom team for a monthly trip to support a new hub or cluster creation and to educate cluster leaders and key people in the capital Vilnius in info war techniques.
Yeah, that's right. And the influences go backwards and forwards. I mean, there's a truly massive network of people here. And if you look at the documents, there are many, many names who you won't be familiar with and who don't appear even in the most obvious or the most obscure government sources. There are people in intelligence operations whose names don't appear anywhere on the internet, but who, as a result of these documents, we have found out about. So there's a lot of really odd people involved in this, which is gives us a much better insight than we would have had before.
Yeah. To what extent are we just scratching the surface? I mean, I've always felt like when I came under attack for publishing on the White Helmets, that the Syria campaign, which I reported on, and they gave me some access and quotes, and I basically, exposed them as the public relations arm of a USAID and British Foreign Office propaganda operation to trigger military intervention. The attacks haven't stopped, but they appear really coordinated, and they, sort of took their time to develop their narrative. And it's the typical narrative of like, I'm a Russian agent, yada, yada, yada. But, there are just so many operations going on.
There are very many operations. I mean, if you look at the Foreign Office's website, they have a document which they release every month on all the money they have spent on these kinds of contracts, over £25,000. And if you look through those documents, you see all sorts of Atlantic Council-related think tanks. Right. You see PR firms which are active in Syria, providing press and public relations activity for the Syrian armed opposition.
Right.
And there are literally tens of these operations. We're looking at the Integrity Initiative because we've got documents, but we don't have documents on all the rest of them. And one of the documents I'm referring to refers to the Atlantic Council's lab, which is run by Ben Nimmo, isn't it? Which in October this year got something like £480,000 from the Foreign Office.
Talk about that.
This is the guy who we will remember did a study of Russian bots influencing politics, and named two of them who turned out to be not bots, but actually real individuals. And that's being paid for by the Foreign Office as well as probably other governments. So this is part of a much, much wider effort to propagandize the British and the American public, and indeed publics all across the world.
And that lab, the Digital Forensics Research Lab that Ben Nimmo partly runs, which is funded. Now we see we knew that there was NATO backing for it, but there was some. This is new to us, and that Ben Nimmo was a consultant on a retainer with the Institute for Statecraft, the military intelligence cutout. The Digital Forensics Research Lab has been hired by Facebook to vet content and is possibly suppressing dissenting news sources and opinion sources as Facebook scrubs them from the internet. And we also have seen Facebook fund the Institute for Statecraft and the Integrity Initiative.
That's right. So we have an impossibly circular sort of process here that governments and corporations are funding each other to do work for each other. I mean, it's very incestuous, and there's no real democratic accountability or oversight. We don't even know about most of these things.
And it just appears that there's so little interest and maybe a lot of fear in imposing scrutiny. The one other article that I've seen in mainstream media is by Chris York, whose tweets were favorited early on by the Integrity Initiative, who's basically this sort of Russiagate stenographer at the Huffington Post. And his piece was basically like, this is a Russian propaganda operation, nothing to see here. And then Edward Lucas, has a similar piece in British media. Nothing to see here. It's all overhyped. And, don't mind the fact that I am working with this initiative and that my Center for European Policy Analysis is named as a partner organization by a British military intelligence cutout while it's operating as a supposedly independent think tank in Washington, doing the same thing the Integrity Initiative does, hosting journalists, doing conferences, sending them on trips, etc. To provide context for people and to understand why this is important, Proper Not appeared out of nowhere after Trump's election and introduced a McCarthyite blacklist of alternative online news and opinion sites, including Truthdig, which we both written for, calling them basically Kremlin disinformation outlets that helped Trump get elected. And then it was pushed on the front page of the Washington Post, and former Obama and Clinton insiders were sharing it everywhere. And then it was basically discredited. And it appears to me that it was sort of a failed attempt at doing what the Integrity Initiative and the Hamilton 68, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and these more sophisticated government operations did later. And so they basically, all the staff must have left and moved on, and then they left the Twitter account to some whack job.
Yeah, I think Proper Not is probably the most amateur of all of these operations. There are a lot, and this doesn't even mention the cottage industry of cybersecurity firms that have all emerged. They're staffed by former U.S. government operatives who realize that now in the private sector, they can make a lot of money profiting off of all this Russiagate mania. So New Knowledge is one of the most recent. There are several, but New Knowledge was formed probably 2 years ago. It's quite new. And its COO and co-founder spent 15 years working at the NSA. He also worked for U.S. Army intelligence, and then he left the military and NSA, and he just went into the private sector, and his firm was hired by the Senate Intelligence Committee to produce a report looking through some tweets to show that Russia supposedly influenced the 2016 election in social media. How much money did he get from the Senate Intelligence Committee? I'm sure he and his colleagues are making a lot of money, and they're just producing their former U.S. government operatives who are now producing propaganda on behalf of the Senate to help fuel the flames of Russiagate, and they're making bank.
So the last question, because we're kind of wearing you out here, and it's late there, you have a family and so on. Got to put food on our families, as George W. Bush said. I'd asked earlier, if you see any resemblance to Operation Mockingbird.
Yes.
And, you're the director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies. I mean, how does what we've learned here sort of fit within the propaganda model?
Well, I think what we see here is an example of a return to the kinds of techniques which were used in the early Cold War by the CIA. A return to covert propaganda on behalf of the British government through the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Home Office here, where there's a whole range of covert activities which had been stopped in the British government from about the late 1970s. There used to be an organisation in the Foreign Office called the Information Research Department, set up in 1947 and shut down by Labour in 1977. And that was engaged in covert propaganda and indeed in undermining the left for all that time, and it became difficult for them to do that. But now, since 9/11 and the developments since then, they're right back at the whole area of covert propaganda, and it reminds me very much of Operation Mockingbird, of the attempts by the CIA to fund researchers during the Vietnam War and to fund social movements, the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, all of whom have got covert subsidies from the CIA. The Congress on Cultural Freedom, one of the most important ones, funded directly by the CIA. And that all came to an end when they were exposed in the 60s. But we're right back at the same place now, where covert propaganda is a preferred tool of government action, and so we have the prospect before us of developing a movement which can force these things to be stopped once again. And I think that's the core that we take from this, that the leftist movements can stop this kind of thing from happening by exposing them. That's what happened last time.
Absolutely, and we're working on it. At the Gray Zone Project. I know you're working on it. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. We'll continue to follow up on all of our different Kremlin disinformation outlets. So, Ben, if you want to take us out and introduce people to our Patreon account where they can support more information wars.
Absolutely. If you'd like watching and listening to this show, you can support us at Patreon. That is patreon.com/moderate rebels. Max and I completely produce this on our own independently, and we fund everything. So for any viewers, any support you could provide helps us do this kind of original journalism and helps us bring on guests like David, who, like us, does not get a platform in mainstream media. So thanks for joining us, David. That was great.
Cheers.
Get some rest.
Bye-bye.